How many times must a good man be seen as a threat before the world finally sees his heart? In the heart of Newark, where the cracked sidewalks tell stories of dreams deferred and the morning air hangs heavy with silent struggle, a man named Elijah Brooks, 42, clutched the last few wrinkled bills in his near-empty wallet. The chill of dawn cut through his worn coat as he stepped out of a dilapidated grocery store, the fluorescent lights buzzing like tired sighs behind him. Elijah's boots scraped against the icy pavement, every step a reminder of how far he had fallen from the life he once believed he was building. As he adjusted the single plastic grocery bag in his calloused hand, he noticed a small figure, barely 6 years old, huddled on the curb, blonde curls matted against a tear-streaked face. She wore a pale pink jacket, too pristine for this battered part of town. Her legs pulled tightly to her chest, shoulders trembling with hiccuping sobs. Elijah froze, heart clenching. Every instinct warned him that stepping closer could mean trouble. Men like him, men whose skin bore the story of generations, weren't often granted the presumption of innocence. Yet as the girl, whose name he would later learn was Emily Clark, lifted her frightened, pleading eyes toward him, Elijah knew the cost of walking away would be greater than the risk of stepping forward. What he couldn't know in that fragile, shivering moment was that this decision, to kneel, to reach out a hand instead of turning away, would ignite a series of events that could alter the course of his life forever. The morning light stretched long and uncertain across the empty parking lot, bathing the cracked asphalt and battered cars in a cold, unforgiving glow. Elijah's truck, an ancient Ford held together more by stubbornness than steel, waited for him at the edge of the lot. Its sagging frame mirrored the weight Elijah carried daily, the relentless pressure of overdue rent, the gnawing fear of losing the only roof over his and his 8-year-old son's heads, and the quiet, suffocating ache of dreams slipping further out of reach. At home, Elijah's world was one of flickering lights and peeling wallpaper, a place where every creak of the floorboards echoed with the struggle of survival. His son, Noah Brooks, thin for his age yet fiercely bright-omed, was his anchor and his burden all at once. Noah deserved more. A backyard to run wild in, warm meals that filled more than just the stomach, nights free of whispered worries about eviction. But hope, Elijah had learned, was a dangerous thing. It could lift you just high enough to break you when you fell. This morning, like so many before it, had begun with the familiar ritual of rationing. Scraping the last of the peanut butter from the jar, slicing bread thin enough to stretch through the week. Noah, ever the optimist despite his too thin frame and hand-me-down clothes, had spoken eagerly about an art project at school, a big house, he said, with a backyard, a swing, and a giant dog, a vision so vivid it nearly shattered Elijah's worn-down resolve. Elijah had smiled, forced lightness into his voice, promised a future he wasn't sure he could ever deliver. He had clutched that fragile hope as tightly as he clutched Noah's small hand on their way to school. The boys' chatter about colors and dogs filling the cold air with warmth Elijah could hardly afford to feel. He had dropped Noah off with a ruffle of hair and a whispered prayer, then turned toward the grocery store, mind grinding over how he could stretch a few dollars across a week of empty shelves and unpaid bills. And now here he stood, staring at a lost little girl whose presence cracked the thin shell he had built around himself. Elijah knew too well the dangers of misinterpretation, the ease with which kindness could be twisted into suspicion when painted across skin like his. But he also knew the unbearable thought of Noah sitting alone, scared, with no one willing to help. Sometimes life tests a man, not when he is strong, but when he is breaking. And so, with a heart both trembling and steadfast, Elijah stepped forward, not knowing that kindness, once released, often has a way of circling back when it's needed most. Before we step fully into Elijah and Emily's journey, a journey marked by unexpected grace, silent battles, and the stubborn glow of hope, I invite you to settle in. Find a comfortable spot, pour yourself a warm cup of coffee or tea, and allow yourself the space to truly listen. This is not just a story, it's a mirror. It's a reminder of how a single choice, made in the quietest moment, can echo louder than all the noise the world tries to make. Now let's begin. The weight of broken dreams is heaviest just before dawn. Elijah Brooks sat hunched at the edge of his battered couch, his broad hands cradling his head, as the first ghostly fingers of morning light slipped through the cracked blinds of his tiny apartment. The faded upholstery of the couch scratched against his skin, a reminder of how time wore down even the strongest things. The air inside the room was thick, saturated with the musty scent of old leather, motor oil, and something harder to name. The quiet bitterness of all the things he had lost. The apartment barely deserved the name. The wallpaper, once a cheerful floral pattern, now sagged from the walls like the exhausted sigh of a life stretched too thin. The faint buzz of a flickering overhead light was the only sound accompanying Elijah's heavy breathing. Every corner of the room, every creaking floorboard, every crack in the stained ceiling whispered of defeat he had not yet accepted aloud. 3 years ago, Elijah had stood tall at Henderson's Auto Repair, his name stitched proudly onto his uniform, his hands steady, his heart full. For a time, fixing broken things had given him a purpose, a quiet kind of pride in being needed, in earning each dollar with sweat and skill. Then the shop had closed overnight, a casualty of layoffs and an economy that had little room for men like him. Without warning, Elijah had been stripped of his anchor, thrown into a world where hard work meant little and second chances were rarer than miracles. Now he survived on scraps of labor, hauling heavy crates at the docks, cleaning moldy garages for people who barely looked him in the eye, repairing busted air conditioners in houses that smelled of new paint and fresh ambition, places that reminded him, cruelly, of how far away home really was. The money was never enough. The bills piled up faster than he could chase them, their crisp, impersonal threats slipping under his door like little knives. The landlord, once all smiles and casual jokes, had hardened into cold warnings and ultimatums. 2 months behind on rent, one more missed payment, and the thin walls that barely contained his dignity would collapse altogether. Elijah shifted on the couch, the springs groaning under his weight. He ran a rough hand down his face, feeling the stubble, the exhaustion, the helplessness rooted into his bones. He thought of Noah, his sweet, too-thin boy with the heart of a lion, sleeping in the next room, under a quilt patched with love and necessity. Noah deserved more than this decaying place, with its mildew-stained carpets and refrigerator that hummed like a broken promise. He deserved a yard to run in, a sturdy bed that didn't squeak in protest, and a fridge full of possibilities, not scarcity. He deserved mornings filled with laughter, not the worried glances of a father wondering how to feed him for another day. But reality cared little for what a man deserved. The fridge door groaned as Elijah opened it, its rubber seals gaping like a wound. Inside, half a carton of milk turning sour at the edges, 2 slices of bread clinging to each other in mutual desperation, and a nearly empty jar of peanut butter. The kind of rationing that turned dignity into survival instinct. He sighed, grabbed the bread, and scraped what little peanut butter remained with a butter knife, spreading it so thin it almost disappeared into the fabric of the bread. It was a small art form, learned from years of pretending that a meal was a feast. "Breakfast, champ," he called softly. From the narrow bedroom, Noah Brooks shuffled in, the sleeves of his second-hand pajamas trailing past his wrists. At 8 years old, Noah was too thin for his age, his curly hair tousled from sleep, his dark brown eyes wide and searching, full of a hope that both inspired Elijah and broke him. Noah climbed onto a wobbly kitchen chair, accepting the piece of toast without complaint. He never complained. Not about the cold rooms, the peeling paint, the nights when dinner was just toast and water. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice light, easy, as if gratitude were the only thing he knew how to offer. Elijah sat across from him, hands folded tightly, watching every careful bite, every small, determined chew. "Big day at school?" he asked, forcing brightness into his voice like patching a leak with tape. Noah's face lit up. "Yeah, Miss Williams said we're doing an art project. She said I can draw whatever I want." Elijah smiled, even as something twisted deep in his chest. "What are you going to draw, buddy?" Noah's eyes gleamed. "A big house with a backyard and a swing and a big dog, like in those movies?" Elijah swallowed hard, nodding, pressing a palm against the sting behind his eyes. "Sounds like a masterpiece." Noah grinned and took another bite, his feet swinging lightly under the chair. Then, with the quiet seriousness only children possess, he tilted his head. "Dan, yeah, but do you think things will get better?" The question landed like a stone on Elijah's chest. For a long moment he said nothing, feeling the weight of it threaten to crush what little strength he had left. But when he finally answered, his voice was steady, gentle. "Of course they will," he lied, because he had to. Noah nodded as if he believed it more than Elijah ever could. "I think so too," the boy said simply, smiling with a faith that Elijah didn't dare shatter. Breakfast ended quickly, the way all good things seemed to. Noah licked the peanut butter from his fingers and darted into the bedroom to grab his backpack. Elijah remained at the table, staring at the scarred surface, tracing the old knife marks left behind by tenants before him. Scars on wood, scars on a life. Outside, the city was waking up with a groan. Sirens wailed in the distance, buses rumbled past, trailing exhaust like gray banners. The cracked sidewalks glistened with the remnants of last night's rain, and the trees, stripped nearly bare by autumn, stretched their skeleton limbs toward a pale, indifferent sky. Elijah wrapped his battered coat around himself tighter, the zipper catching briefly on a tear he didn't have time or money to fix. Noah slipped his small hand into Elijah's as they stepped out into the biting morning, the bond between them stronger than any roof they lacked. As they walked, Noah chattered about his project, about the colors he would use, the swings he would draw swaying in an imagined breeze. Elijah listened with half a mind, his thoughts trapped in the grinding machinery of rent due, trucks breaking down, jobs slipping through desperate fingers. At the school gates, Elijah crouched down to Noah's level, adjusting the frame straps on the boy's too big backpack. "You have a good day, champ," he said, brushing a hand over Noah's curls. "You too, Dad." Noah beamed, before disappearing into the swarm of children. For a fleeting moment, standing there in the cold, Elijah felt a warmth that defied the wind. He stood still, drinking in the sight of his son, running toward a world that had not yet learned to break his spirit. Then, shoulders stiffening against the chill, Elijah turned and made his way toward the grocery store, toward the cold arithmetic of hunger and need, toward the choices no man should have to make. Unseen, uncelebrated, unbroken. For now, Elijah's boots struck the cracked sidewalk with dull rhythmic thuds as he made his way toward the small grocery store, the worn leather soles slapping against a cold concrete with a stubborn kind of defiance. The grocery list in his mind was short and brutal: milk, bread, peanut butter, essentials stretched thinner than hope. His breath puffed out in short clouds that quickly dissolved into the brittle morning air, leaving no trace behind, much like the countless men who had walked these streets before him, burdened with dreams too heavy for the world to carry. The store's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a harsh, pitiless glow, bleaching the battered aisles in a lifeless white. Elijah moved like a man who had memorized every cracked tile, every flickering light, every blind corner where a wrong look could become a wrong outcome. His hand tightened instinctively around his wallet, feeling the sad thinness of it through his coat. He moved methodically through the aisles. First the bread, then the peanut butter, then the milk, each item chosen not by desire but by necessity, like a man picking weapons for a battle he already knew he would lose. At the register, Elijah pulled out the folded bills with fingers cracked from cold and work, laying them out one by one, like small surrenders. The cashier, a young man barely older than Noah, with pimples and a bored stare, didn't say a word. The world often moved around Elijah without seeing him. The final total flashed red on the screen. Elijah exhaled through his nose, the sound sharp, brittle. He handed over the cash, ignoring the shame that gnawed at the edges of his pride, and gathered his meager supplies into a flimsy plastic bag. As he stepped out of the store, the sunlight had grown sharper, harsher, stabbing off the parked cars and cracked asphalt like blades. He adjusted the bag in his hand, pulling his coat tighter against the wind that cut through him like glass. And then he saw her. A small figure folded into herself on the curb just outside the store's entrance. A little girl, no older than 6, blonde hair twisted into pigtails now matted with tears and dirt, a pink jacket far too clean for this rough neighborhood. She was crying. Not the loud, defiant wailing of a child demanding attention, but the quiet, broken sobs of someone utterly lost. Her small shoulders trembled violently, her hands clutching at the fabric of her coat with white-knuckled desperation. Whiter froze. Every muscle in his body tightened. He knew what this looked like. He knew how a single wrong move could turn kindness into accusation. Men like him didn't get the benefit of the doubt. They got suspicion. They got sirens. For a moment, a long, terrible moment, he thought about walking away, but then he pictured Noah, alone, scared, crying for help that never came. A muscle in Elijah's jaw jumped. He shifted the grocery bag into one hand and walked slowly toward the girl, keeping his body low and unthreatening. As he approached, the girl, Emily Clark, though he did not yet know her name, flinched, her eyes wide with terror, her body shrinking back instinctively. He stopped several feet away, crouching down to her level, the cold from the pavement seeping into his knees. "Hey there, sweetheart," Elijah said, his voice a low, warm rumble. "You okay?" Emily sniffled, her lower lip quivering. She hugged herself tighter, rocking slightly, but said nothing. Elijah lowered his gaze to the ground, showing her his hands, empty, palms up. Non-threatening. A man with nothing to hide. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said gently. "Promise." Another sniffle. A tiny nod. "What's your name, kiddo?" he asked softly. "Emily," she whispered, the word barely a thread. Elijah smiled, not too wide, just enough to be human. "Hi, Emily. I'm Elijah. You lost?" A shaky nod. "You know your mom's phone number?" Another nod. Emily dug into the tiny backpack at her feet with trembling hands, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. Elijah reached out slowly, carefully, and took it. A phone number, scrawled in a child's hand, and an address. He pulled out his battered old phone, dialing the number with fingers stiff from the cold. 1 ring. 2. Listening to. He tried again. Still nothing. Elijah glanced at the address scribbled beneath the number. It wasn't far. He looked at Emily, at the way she twisted the straps of her backpack in her tiny hands, her breath coming in shallow, frightened gasps. Though the right thing to do, the safe thing, would be to call the police. But the thought of Emily sitting alone in a station, surrounded by strangers in uniforms, terrified and cold, gnawed at Elijah's gut. He made a decision. "Okay, Emily," he said, his voice steady. "How about this? I'll take you home. We'll find your mom together." Emily hesitated, her blue eyes flickering with uncertainty, fear, hope. "You don't have to if you don't want," Elijah added quickly. "We can wait here for a police officer, if that makes you feel safer. Or, if you want, you can sit in my truck, and I won't even start the engine until you're buckled in. Your call." For a long, frozen moment, Emily stared at him. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Elijah smiled, feeling a crack of warmth split through the ice in his chest. "All right then," he said softly. He led her carefully to his truck, the battered Ford groaning as he opened the passenger door. He lifted her in gently, buckling her seatbelt with hands that trembled just slightly. He walked around to the driver's side, started the engine only after making sure Emily was secure, and pulled out of the parking lot with a deep, steadying breath. As they drove, the city blurred past, crumbling brick buildings, sagging fences, graffiti-streaked walls, all of it a backdrop to a moment that felt strangely suspended outside of time. Emily spoke first, her voice small but certain. "You're nice," she said simply. Elijah laughed quietly, a rough sound. "You don't even know me, kid." Emily shrugged, staring out the window. "You didn't leave me." The words hit Elijah like a hammer to the heart. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his throat thick. "I guess that counts for something," he muttered. Neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to. The silence was a kind of trust. As they turned onto a street where the houses grew bigger, cleaner, wealthier, Elijah felt the weight of the world press harder against his chest. His truck's rusty frame creaked in protest, an unwanted reminder that he didn't belong here. But he kept driving, kept his promise. 10 minutes later, they pulled up in front of a pristine 2-story house with white shutters and a manicured lawn. Before Elijah could even shift into park, the front door flew open. A woman, tall, frantic, breathless, ran down the steps, her coat flaring behind her like a flag of desperation. "Emily," she screamed. Emily fumbled with her seatbelt, bursting from the truck and into her mother's arms. Elijah sat frozen for a moment, watching the reunion, feeling something hollow and aching tear loose inside him. He climbed out slowly, the grocery bag still dangling from his hand, and approached. The mother. Isabel Clark, though he would learn her name later, clutched her daughter fiercely, raining frantic kisses onto her tangled hair. "Find you." "I couldn't find you," Emily sobbed. "I'm here, baby," Isabel whispered, voice breaking. "I'm here." Then Isabel looked up, saw Elijah, and everything shifted. The fear, the calculation, the subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of her arms around Emily. The moment when she asked herself, friend or threat. Elijah felt it like a slap, her familiar, bitter sting. But he stood his ground, his voice even, steady. "I found her outside the store," he said simply. "She had this." He held out the crumpled piece of paper. Isabel hesitated. Then, slowly, she took it from him, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she said, the words low, reluctant but real. "You're welcome," Elijah said, turning back toward his truck. As he climbed into the battered Ford, he caught one last glimpse of Emily over her mother's shoulder, a small hand waving, a smile fighting through the tears. And in that moment, that tiny, defiant moment, Elijah felt something warm flicker to life inside him again. Elijah's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he pulled away from the Clark house, his knuckles whitening under the strain. The neatly trimmed lawns, the polished cars, the pristine sidewalks, they blurred into a single, blinding wall of everything he had been told he would never have. The engine of his battered Ford growled low, a tired beast limping through enemy territory. Elijah didn't let the truck rush. He drove slowly, deliberately, like a man walking backward through a dream he didn't belong in. As he crossed the invisible line between the manicured order of the Clark's neighborhood and the cracked, uneven streets of his own, Elijah felt something in his chest shift. Not break, not shatter, but stretch painfully against the hard walls he had built around himself. By the time he parked in front of his apartment, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the skyline, casting the lot in long, bleeding shadows. He sat there for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, the bag of groceries still untouched on the passenger seat. His head dropped forward onto the steering wheel, the rough, cracked leather pressing into his forehead. One breath. Two. He pushed himself upright, grabbed the bag, and climbed out. The metal of the truck door screamed in protest as he slammed it shut. His boots crunched on gravel. His breath smoked in the cooling air. And then the sleek black car. It slid into the lot like a ghost, its body gleaming with an arrogance that seemed to mock everything around it. The rusted sedans, the dented pickups, the weary men who drove them. Elijah's heart kicked once, hard. He adjusted the grocery bag in his hand, instincts flaring sharp and fast. The car door opened with a soft, expensive thump. Out stepped a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark tailored suit that probably cost more than Elijah's rent for a year. The man's gaze found him instantly, sharp and assessing. Elijah's muscles tensed, the weight of 1,000 past encounters anchoring him to the cracked pavement. "Mr. Brooks," the man called, his voice smooth, practiced. Elijah said nothing. He just stood there, a statue carved from suspicion and caution. The man approached, extending a hand. "Gregory Bennett," he said. "My wife told me what you did for our daughter." Elijah's gaze flicked to the outstretched hand, then back to Gregory's face. He didn't move to shake it. Instead, he tightened his grip on the plastic bag until the thin handles cut into his fingers. "I don't need a thank you," Elijah said, voice low and even. Gregory smiled, not patronizing, not pitying, but with a strange, measured respect. "I'm not here to offer gratitude," he said simply. "I'm here to offer opportunity." The words fell heavy between them, incongruous with the bleak surroundings. Elijah frowned, suspicion hardening his features. "What kind of opportunity?" he asked, voice gruff. Gregory stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "I run Bennett Developments, construction, renovation, real estate. We're always looking for men with work ethic, and the kind of character you showed today." Elijah shook his head slowly, the bag rustling against his coat. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Gregory said. "I know you didn't walk away. I know you didn't expect anything in return. And I know good men when I see them." A beat of silence stretched between them, thick and brittle. The dying light painted Elijah's face in long shadows. The air smelled of dust, exhaust, and a hope so fragile he barely dared to breathe it. Gregory pulled a business card from his jacket pocket, holding it out between two fingers. "Think about it," he said. "No strings attached, just a chance." Elijah hesitated, staring at the card like it might bite him. Finally, he reached out. Slow, deliberate, and took it. His fingers brushed Gregory's, and in that brief contact, something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the first crack in a wall built too high for too long. Gregory nodded once, a small, final gesture of respect. "Hoped to hear from you," he said, then turned, climbing back into his sleek black car. The engine purred to life. The car glided away, leaving Elijah standing in the middle of the lot, the card burning against his palm. He didn't move for a long time. When he finally did, it was with slow, deliberate steps. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped into the dim, musty room he called home. Noah was there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, crayons scattered around him, head bent over a sheet of paper. He looked up, face lighting with a smile that hit Elijah harder than anything Gregory had said. "Hey, Dad," Noah beamed. "Guess what? I finished my picture." Elijah dropped the grocery bag onto the counter, crossing the room in 2 long strides. He knelt beside his son, every ache in his body forgotten. Noah held up the drawing proudly. It was crude, childish, and perfect. A big house, a backyard, a swing, the giant joyful dog. Everything Noah dreamed of. Everything Elijah had told himself was out of reach. Elijah swallowed hard, blinking fast. "It's beautiful, bud," he said, voice thick. Noah studied him, his bright eyes searching. "You look different, Dad," he said quietly. Elijah exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face, feeling the grime, the exhaustion, and something else he hadn't felt in a long time. "Maybe I am," he said, voice rough with unshed tears. "Maybe, just maybe, things are starting to change." Outside the cracked window, the last of the sunlight bled away into night. Inside, father and son sat together on the worn linoleum floor, surrounded by crayons and impossible dreams. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, impossible wasn't forever. The morning Elijah Brooks woke up to keep his promise to himself felt heavier than any other in recent memory. The alarm buzzed in the darkness, a shrill, ugly sound. Elijah reached out with a heavy hand and silenced it. For a moment he sat at the edge of his bed, shoulders slumped, the cracked linoleum cold beneath his bare feet. The air smelled of dust and old coffee. Outside, the world was still black and silent, the city not yet awake enough to remember its own sorrow. The business card Gregory Bennett had given him sat on the kitchen table, right where he had left it the night before, its edges worn slightly from being turned over and over in his hands. Elijah stared at it for a long moment, the pale light from the single bulb above him casting harsh shadows across the faded lettering. Then he rose. The old springs in the mattress groaned as he stood. He moved through the motions with the silent reverence of a soldier preparing for battle. Jeans, heavy boots, worn flannel shirt, jacket patched at the elbows. He tied his boots with a double knot as if daring the day to try and untie him. Before leaving, he walked quietly to Noah's bedroom. The boy was sprawled across the thin mattress, one hand still gripping a crayon like a sword in sleep. Elijah stood there for a moment, watching his son breathe, slow, steady, unbroken. "I'll make it better, kiddo," Elijah whispered into the dark. "I swear." He pulled the door shut with a soft click, grabbed the keys to the old Ford, and stepped into the bitter morning air. The truck shuddered to life under his coaxing hands, coughing and wheezing like an old man shaking off a long night. The drive to Bennett Developments was a blur of gray streets and blinking traffic lights, of storefronts still shuttered and sidewalks littered with yesterday's broken promises. When Elijah pulled into the construction site, dawn had only just begun to brush its pale fingers across the horizon. The place was already alive. The metallic clang of steel beams, the low roar of machinery, the barked orders of men used to making things stand straight in a world that leaned crooked. Elijah parked far from the office trailers, not out of necessity but habit, and sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white. "You don't belong here," the old fear whispered. But another voice, quieter, stronger, answered, "You belong anywhere you build something with your own hands." Elijah shoved the door open, stepping out into the mud with a determined crunch. A stocky man with a salt and pepper beard stood near a supply shed, shouting instructions over the din. His voice cut through the noise like a saw blade through timber. Elijah approached. "You, Hank?" he called out. The man turned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in Elijah's stance, his clothes, his face. "You, Brooks?" he barked back. Elijah nodded once, firm. "Hank Davis, foreman, battle-worn and unbothered," grunted. "Bennett says you're a hard worker. Hope to hell he's right. We don't babysit here." "He didn't come here to be babysat," Elijah said evenly. Hank's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. "Good. Grab those boards. Follow Marcus. Don't screw it up." Elijah moved without hesitation, falling into step beside a wiry young man with quick hands and wary eyes. The day unfolded in a brutal rhythm. Lift, haul, hammer, rip. The weight of the lumber bit into Elijah's shoulders. The grit of the air sanded his throat raw, and the unrelenting pace hammered against muscles long accustomed to weariness. But he didn't stop, and didn't complain. When splinters tore into his palms, he wrapped them tighter around the boards. When sweat blurred his vision, he blinked it away and swung the hammer harder. When his legs trembled from the strain, he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. By midday, his shirt was soaked through with sweat. Dust caked in the creases of his skin. Hank watched him from a distance, arms folded across his chest, saying nothing. During the short lunch break, Elijah sat alone on a stack of plywood, unwrapping a peanut butter sandwich from wax paper with shaking hands. He ate slowly, mechanically, like fueling a machine rather than feeding a man. The sky overhead stretched vast and merciless, a sheet of faded blue pinned down by the skeletons of half-finished buildings. A few workers glanced at him curiously, but no one said much. New blood was always a gamble, and respect had to be earned, not gifted. Elijah welcomed the silence. He had no words left for small talk. When the whistle blew, signaling the end of lunch, he stood up, every muscle screaming, and got back to work. The afternoon passed in a blur of sweat, barked commands, and the heavy music of labor. At one point, tasked with carrying heavy rebar across the site, Elijah stumbled, the sharp metal biting into his shoulder. The younger workers nearby paused, half expecting him to curse, to drop it, to quit. But Elijah didn't falter. He adjusted his grip, sucked in a breath through gritted teeth, and kept moving, every step a testament, every inch a declaration. As the sun dipped low, casting long, burning shadows across the site, the day's work finally ground to a halt. Elijah dropped his last load with a grunt, his body trembling from exertion. He stood there for a moment, chest heaving, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. Then, footstep. He turned to see Gregory Bennett crossing the lot toward him, sleeves rolled up, eyes sharp and assessing. "Walk with me," Gregory said without preamble. Elijah fell into step beside him, every muscle aching, every instinct wary. They stopped near a stack of steel beams, the skeleton of tomorrow's building reaching into the bruised sky. "You did good work today," Gregory said simply. Eli shrugged, the motion stiff and painful. "Just doing the job." Gregory smiled. "Small, real. That's exactly why I want to offer you more." Elijah blinked, the words sinking slow and heavy. "The one?" Gregory nodded. "There's a management training program for guys who show leadership potential. It's hard. It's more responsibility, but it leads somewhere." He paused, studying Elijah's face. "I see something in you, Brooks. Not just muscle, not just endurance. Character, and we need more of that." For a long stretched moment, Elijah said nothing. The wind whispered across the site, carrying with it the scent of wet cement and the promise of things not yet built. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice low but sure. "Are you sure you're not making a mistake?" Gregory laughed, the sound brief and genuine. "Already made enough of those to know when I'm not." He extended his hand again, not as an offer, but as a bridge. Elijah looked at it, then took it, his grip strong, steady. "I won't let you down," he said, his voice raw with the weight of every broken promise he had ever carried. Gregory's smile deepened. "I know you." As they shook hands, the steel beams cast long, defiant shadows behind them, a reminder that sometimes, from the ruins of what was, something stronger could rise. Elijah Brooks stood under the bruised morning sky, hard hat in hand, watching the skeleton of the new building claw its way into existence. Each beam, each bolt, each slab of concrete carried the weight of something bigger than steel. It carried the weight of second chances. The first few weeks of the management training program were brutal in ways Elijah hadn't anticipated. Not physically, although the days were long and his body never seemed to fully recover, but mentally, emotionally. He wasn't just hauling material anymore. He was responsible for schedules, for safety protocols, for teams of men who barely masked their skepticism. He was the outsider, the one who didn't belong to the world of polished boots and clean fingernails, the one who had calluses under his calluses and a gaze sharpened by survival, not strategy. Every morning as he pulled into the lot, Elijah felt the weight of their eyes on him, measuring, doubting, waiting for him to stumble. And stumble he did. His first attempt at leading a team ended in chaos, miscommunication, late deliveries, a near-miss accident that had Hank Davis chewing him out in front of half the crew. "You want to lead?" Hank had barked, veins standing out on his neck. "Then act like it. You don't get respect handed to you on a silver platter, Brooks. You earn it, every damn day." Elijah had stood there, fists clenched at his sides, swallowing the hot burn of humiliation. Not because Hank was wrong, but because Hank was right. He went home that night more exhausted than he thought possible, collapsing into the rickety chair at the kitchen table while Noah worked on his homework. The boy looked up, sensing something different, something heavy. "You okay, Dad?" Noah asked softly. Elijah stared at the cracked tabletop for a long moment before answering. "Yeah," he finally said, voice rough. "Just building something bigger than a house, buddy." Noah tilted his head, puzzled. "Bigger than a house?" Elijah forced a small smile. "Bigger than a house," he echoed. "Bigger than anything we can see right now." The next day, Elijah showed up an hour early. He pored over the site plans until his eyes blurred. He asked questions, dozens of them, from anyone willing to answer, swallowing his pride each time. He learned to read not just the blueprints but the rhythm of the men around him, who worked better under pressure, who needed patience, who responded to quiet encouragement instead of barking orders. Slowly, day by grueling day, he began to change the shape of things. He listened. He adapted. He didn't try to bulldoze his way through resistance. He built bridges instead. When a young worker named Luis froze halfway up a scaffold one windy afternoon, Elijah didn't yell. He climbed up, himself, steady and sure, the wind tugging at his jacket, and stood there beside the trembling boy. "Scared is okay," Elijah said quietly. "Frozen is what gets you hurt." Luis nodded, white-knuckled, and together they climbed back down, one step at a time. Word spread, not quickly, but surely. Elijah wasn't just another guy barking orders. He was the one who showed up early, stayed late, and never asked a man to do something he wouldn't do himself. Respect, once withheld like water from a stranger in the desert, began to seep in. Slow, cautious, but real. It showed in the way the crews moved when Elijah called out instructions. It showed in the way Hank Davis stopped hovering quite so closely, grunting instead of growling when Elijah made a tough call. And it showed most clearly the day the crane jammed. It was a brutal afternoon, the sun hammering down like a fist when the massive crane froze mid-lift, dangling a steel beam high over the half-built structure. Panic rippled through the site like a brush fire. Elijah reacted without thinking. He barked sharp orders, clearing the danger zone, directing traffic, coordinating with the crane operator to ease the malfunctioning beam down safely. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't smooth. But no one got hurt. When the crisis passed, Elijah stood in the middle of the dusty lot, hands on hips, chest heaving, sweat streaming down his face. A slow, scattered applause broke out among the workers. He approached, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. "You kept your head," Hank said gruffly. "Good. Men follow men who don't panic." Elijah met his gaze steadily, something inside him settling for the first time in years. Later that night, after scrubbing layers of dirt and grime from his skin, Elijah sat with Noah on their threadbare couch. Noah leaned against his side, eyes drooping with sleep. "Did you build something today, Dad?" Noah mumbled. Elijah smiled, running a calloused hand through his son's curls. "Yeah, buddy," he said softly. "I think I did. Not just walls, not just floors. Something bigger. Into something stronger. A life worth living." Weeks bled into months, each day stacking atop the last like bricks laid by calloused hands. The construction site changed, with Elijah growing stronger, sharper, rising into something tangible against the unforgiving skyline. Elijah learned to carry the weight of leadership the same way he carried rebar and lumber. Shoulders square, back straight, no room for doubt. It didn't go unnoticed. One chilly Friday afternoon, when the sun was little more than a dull smear behind heavy clouds, Elijah found himself summoned to the main trailer, the command center of Bennett Developments. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled faintly of coffee and sawdust. Papers were scattered across the big central table, like a battlefield of deals and deadlines. Gregory Bennett sat at the head of the table, a stack of blueprints to his left, a tablet glowing dimly at his right hand. He looked up as Elijah entered. For a long, measured moment, Gregory just studied him, not sizing him up anymore, but weighing something more important. "You've been busy," Gregory said finally, voice even. "Trying," Elijah replied, wiping his muddy boots on the mat before stepping further inside. Gregory leaned back in his chair, hands folded loosely over his stomach. "You've built more than that structure out there," he said. "You've built trust, stability, leadership." Elijah shifted on his feet, unsure what to say, unused to praise that didn't feel like it had a catch hidden somewhere. Gregory smiled slightly. "I'm offering you a permanent position," he said. "Site supervisor, full benefits, better pay, more responsibility." The words hung there, heavy and bright, like a sun suddenly breaking through storm clouds. Elijah blinked, feeling the world tilt under him for a dizzying second. "Supervisor," he repeated, almost disbelieving. Gregory nodded once. "You earned it." There was a pause, small but sharp, as if the air itself hesitated. "You don't have to decide right now," Gregory added, a rare softness threading through his tone. "But I hope you will." Elijah's throat tightened. For a long time, life had only ever offered him ultimatums, not choices. Now here he was, standing at the threshold of something real. He would say, Elijah said quietly. Gregory's smile widened into something almost proud. Good, you start Monday. Come by the office, we'll get your paperwork sorted. He stood, extending his hand across the table. Elijah crossed the room in 3 long strides and shook it. Firm, steady, a handshake that meant something. As Elijah left the trailer, the wind hit him full in the face, sharp and cold. But he didn't flinch. He stood there for a moment, looking out over the site, the steel bones of the building stretching toward the darkening sky, cranes frozen mid-swing like massive sentinels. Then, without thinking, he raised his arms high over his head and whooped. A loud, raw sound that startled a few nearby workers into laughing. It was not sound of arrogance. It wasn't even pride. It was release. A letting go of every moment he had doubted himself, every voice that had told him he wasn't enough, every night he had lain awake wondering how much lower he could fall. He laughed again, shaking his head, the sound whipped away by the wind. That night, Elijah returned home later than usual, carrying a small paper bag in his hand. Inside their cramped kitchen, Noah sat at the table, coloring with fierce concentration. When he saw Elijah, his face lit up. "Hey, Dad, look, I drew our dream house again," Noah chirped, holding up a crayon masterpiece, complete with a big dog in the backyard. Elijah set the bag down and crossed the room, crouching so he was eye level with his son. "You know," Elijah said, his voice thick with something that wasn't sadness for once, "we might be closer to that house than you think." Noah blinked wide-eyed. Elijah smiled. Not the tired, hollow smile he had worn for so long, but a real one. A smile that reached his eyes. "Yeah, bud," he said. "Really?" He reached into the paper bag and pulled out 2 cheeseburgers. Real ones, still warm, wrapped in paper slick with grease. Noah's eyes went comically wide. "You got McDonald's?" he gasped, as if Elijah had brought home gold bars. Elijah laughed, ruffling his son's messy curls. "Special occasion," he said. "Tonight we celebrate." And there, in that tiny kitchen with its flickering overhead light and peeling wallpaper, Elijah Brooks and his son feasted like kings on cheeseburgers and hope and the belief that maybe, just maybe, the future was something they could build with their own hands. The following weeks moved with a different kind of gravity. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building, crafting a future with calloused hands and relentless hope. Elijah Brooks woke up each morning with a purpose that ran deeper than the groaning alarm clock or the bitter taste of yesterday's fatigue. He wore his new title, Site Supervisor, not as a crown, but as armor. It wasn't about being above anyone. It was about standing for something. He led crews through rain and wind, through setbacks and breakthroughs, through days where steel wouldn't bend and days when even the sky seemed to lean down in approval. There was pride now in the way he moved across the site, clipboard in hand, boots steady in the mud. Not arrogance. Earned pride. But real change, the kind that reaches down into the bones of a man, always asks for something more. And so, one chilly Thursday evening, after a day spent battling supply shortages and fraying tempers, Elijah found himself once again sitting in front of the small, cracked mirror in his apartment. In his hands was a brochure Gregory had slid across the desk earlier that week. Housing development plans, first-time buyer programs, down payment assistance, and a chance at a home. A real one. He turned the glossy pages slowly, fingertips dragging across images of sunlit kitchens, green backyards, bedrooms with windows that caught the morning light. Places where Noah could have a swing set, where Elijah wouldn't have to lie awake at night listening for the landlord's heavy footsteps outside the door. A knock startled him out of his reverie. Noah stood in the doorway, pajama-clad, barefoot, his hair tousled from sleep. "What you looking at, Dad?" Elijah hesitated, then smiled, holding up the brochure. "Houses," he said simply. Noah's face lit up like someone had flicked a switch inside him. "Are we gonna get one?" Elijah felt his throat tighten. "Maybe," he said. "If we work real hard. If we keep believing." Noah padded into the room, curling up beside him without asking, resting his head against Elijah's arm. "I believe," Noah whispered. The two of them sat there in the pale lamplight, the world outside fading into shadow, and for the first time, Elijah let himself picture it. Not as a dream, but as a blueprint. Not a wish, but a plan. The next day, armed with more hope than certainty, Elijah stepped into a small, slightly shabby real estate office on the edge of town. A bell over the door jingled as he entered, drawing the attention of a kind-faced woman behind the desk. "Can I help you?" she asked. Elijah adjusted the collar of his jacket, suddenly feeling every frayed seam, every worn patch. "Yeah," he said, voice steady. "I'm looking to buy a house." The woman's smile widened. "Well then," she said brightly, "let's find you one." They sat together for an hour, poring over listings Elijah never would have dared glance at 6 months ago. Small homes, fixer-uppers mostly, but homes. Foundations he could build on. There was one property in particular, a modest single-story house with peeling blue paint and a sagging porch, but a big backyard and a sturdy frame. That caught Elijah's eye. It wasn't much, but it could be enough. He put in an application that afternoon, hands trembling slightly as he signed the paperwork. When he stepped outside afterward, the sun was breaking through heavy clouds, spilling golden light across the cracked sidewalk. Elijah stood there, head tilted back, soaking it in, breathing it in. Later that evening, back at the apartment, he sat Noah down at their battered kitchen table. "I did something today," Elijah began. Noah leaned forward, wide-eyed. "What is it?" Elijah smiled, a little shaky, but sure. "I put in an offer on a house," he said. "Our house." Noah's mouth dropped open. "Like a real one? With a yard and everything?" "Yeah," Elijah said, laughing softly. "Exactly like that." Noah whooped so loud it startled their neighbor downstairs, and Elijah laughed until his sides ached, until he could barely catch his breath. That night, Elijah tucked Noah into bed, pulling the threadbare blanket up under his chin. Noah looked up at him, eyes shining. "I'm proud of you, Dad," he said simply. Elijah's heart twisted so hard he had to sit down on the edge of the bed, one hand covering his face. He wasn't the man he had been when he found a lost little girl crying on a curb. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building, and not just for himself. For Noah, for every broken piece of him that had ever wondered if he deserved more. Elijah leaned down and pressed a kiss to Noah's forehead, his voice a rough whisper in the dark. "I'm proud of you too, buddy," he said. "More than you'll ever know." And in the quiet that followed, filled only with the slow, steady breathing of his son, Elijah Brooks dared to believe that he hadn't just found a key to a new door. He had built it. The first night Elijah Brooks and Noah slept in their new home was not in the finished, polished way he might have once imagined. There were no fresh coats of paint yet, no expensive furniture, no framed photos on the walls. Just 2 mattresses on the floor, a pile of boxes pushed against the living room wall, and the faint, lingering smell of fresh-cut lumber from where Elijah had spent the afternoon hammering loose floorboards back into place. The house creaked and groaned around them as if stretching old bones. Outside, the wind chased leaves down the sidewalk in frantic circles. The porch light buzzed softly, its beam casting long shadows that danced across the bare floor. Elijah lay on his mattress, one arm tucked behind his head, staring up at the ceiling. A ceiling that belonged to him now. Noah, curled up under a borrowed quilt, yawned wide and turned to face him. "This is the best house ever," Noah mumbled, voice thick with sleep. Elijah turned his head toward his son, smiling in the dimness. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yeah, it is." For a while they lay in silence, the kind that was full rather than empty, the kind that held promise, like wet earth waiting for seeds. At some point, Noah's breathing slowed, deepened, his small body relaxing fully into sleep. Elijah stayed awake a little longer, letting the moment root itself deep inside him. He thought back to the road that had brought them here, the mornings scraping by with pocket change and prayers, the cracked sidewalks and rusted trucks, and the gnawing fear of eviction. To the afternoon he found Sophie, a tiny trembling figure on the curb, and made a choice, a simple human choice: to stop. He had not known then that one small kindness would ripple outward, colliding with strangers, reshaping the entire trajectory of his life. One choice. Elijah shifted slightly, reaching into the box closest to him. From it, he pulled out a battered photo, a snapshot from long ago, back when he and Noah's mother still thought the world might bend for them, if they just believed hard enough. He traced the edge of the photo with his thumb, the worn paper soft against his calloused skin. Then, without a second thought, he stood up. The floor groaned under his weight as he crossed to the living room window. He taped the photo to the glass with a scrap of clear tape, a simple act, quiet and stubborn. The photo fluttered slightly in the breeze, sneaking through the ill-fitted window frame, but it held. Oh, a reminder, not of what had been lost, but of what had survived. Elijah leaned his forehead against the cool glass, closing his eyes. "I'm still here," he whispered into the dark. "We're still here." The house seemed to settle around him in agreement, its creaks softening into something almost like a sigh. The next morning Elijah rose with the sun, his muscles aching pleasantly from the day's labors before. He brewed the first pot of coffee in his own kitchen, the smell filling the empty rooms like a herald of better days to come. Noah stumbled into the kitchen, hair wild, rubbing his eyes. "You made coffee, Dad?" he asked groggily. "You did," Elijah chuckled, sliding a mug toward the boy. "Filled with hot cocoa, not coffee." They ate breakfast sitting on the floor, plates balanced on their knees, laughing at how weird it felt not to have a table yet. Later that day, Elijah stood out in the backyard, surveying the overgrown tangle of weeds and dry grass. In his mind's eye, he could already see it. A swing set, maybe a vegetable garden, a place for a big, goofy dog to chase sticks. He crouched down, plunged his hands into the dirt, letting the cool earth crumble between his fingers. Planting roots, building something that would outlast fear, hunger, loss. Behind him, Noah bounded out the back door, a soccer ball tucked under his arm. "Come on, Dad," he yelled. "Bet you can't block my goal." Elijah laughed, wiping his hands on his jeans, and rose to meet the challenge. They played until the sun dipped low, casting the backyard in molten gold, their laughter echoing off the fence like music. As twilight fell, Elijah sat on the porch steps, Noah leaning against him, sticky with sweat and dirt and pure joy. For a long time they said nothing. They didn't need to. Because sometimes life isn't rebuilt with grand gestures or perfect plans. Sometimes it's stitched back together with small, stubborn moments. With every swing of a hammer, every shared joke, every muddy soccer match in the backyard of a house you fought to call home. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you find yourself exactly where you're meant to be. Not because the road was smooth, but because you kept walking, even when it wasn't. Elijah Brooks wrapped his arm around Noah, pulling him close. The boy yawned, resting his head on Elijah's shoulder. "Best team ever," Noah murmured. Elisha smiled into the darkening sky, his chest full to bursting. "Yeah, buddy," he whispered back. "Best team ever." And there, under the first shy stars of the evening, a man who had once been lost and a boy who had always believed sat on the porch of their not-so-perfect, absolutely perfect home. Together, thirsted work flashed. At last, there, under the fading warmth of twilight, Elijah Brooks sat on the steps of his worn porch, his son Noah leaning heavily against his side. No cheers, no fanfare, just the quiet pulse of life moving forward. A victory not in headlines, but in heartbeats. It was survival, yes, but also something stronger, a reclaiming, a quiet defiance that said, "We are still here, and we are building." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, repairs to make, roots to deepen, and memories to create in this imperfect but fiercely loved home. And always, the work of remembering that the long shadows of racism do not erase the light of dignity, of family, of hope. The lesson Elijah's story offers us is simple yet profound. Sometimes changing the world doesn't look like grand speeches or sweeping reforms. Sometimes it looks like a man refusing to give up. It looks like reaching out a hand to a scared child. It looks like holding on to kindness when the world expects hardness. True change often grows not from noise, but from perseverance, from small choices, from silent strength, brick by brick, heart by heart. If this story has touched you, we warmly invite you to subscribe to Unheard Racist Stories, a place where every voice matters, every act of courage shines, and every truth helps rebuild a better, fairer world. Share Elijah's story with those you love, because change begins when stories are heard. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Stay close. More stories, more healing await. To you again on Unheard Racist Stories.